What's the biggest governmental duck-up of your country's history? In recent history, our president, first female one that was brainwashed since birth by a Rasputin-like cult leader, which led to a slew of influence peddling and corruption scandals. Not surprising she went to jail though, since every single president in our history has either been assassinated, sent to jail, had their family members, close relatives sent to jail, or committed suicide. Long time ago, when every country in Europe still had proper monarchy, Poland effectively had democracy of nobles. There was a king, but he was powerless, much like modern monarchies, and the actual power was in hands of nobility. At the time it was very progressive. The problem? They had a rule that in order to introduce a new law, everyone present had to agree. Everyone. Which means that one bribe jerk could just say nope, I don't want this, and veto everything. This led to stagnation of law, which led to stagnation of economy, which led to conquest of Poland by neighbors. Who off we have a duck up every 2 weeks, but I'm going to tell this one. This is worth the read. Here in Costa Rica we had a concrete incident, we call it El Cementazo, which was something seemingly small that got from 0 to 100 real ducking quick. This one construction guy bought a shit ton of concrete, cement. However, the duck it's called, he was building a big ass building and got insurance from a private company. Since the public national one rejected his project, it was more loss than gain, and the project was big, so yeah. Time goes on and guess what? Building crumbles. Someone ducking sneezed or something, and it crumbled like dust. The streets around also crumbled. Everything on the 20 million national coin project crumbled to dust, and now the insurance company was down bad. They couldn't pay 20 millions on the spot. The case was taken to court because of the impressive duck up and damage to property. Here is where we get spicy. Why did it crumble like that? It seems the concrete was awful quality and imported illegally from China. A concrete made to build houses fast for a lot of people, brought to a rainy, tectonic country. It only took a bit of rain and an earthquake, nobody felt to tear it down. How did the concrete got approved to enter if it gets monitored? The dude at the cargo let it throughout the border. Just walked through at the front door. Because he had higher up instructions, which himself had higher up instructions, to let the guy pass. And so on and so on. In a matter of one day the whole cabinet was somehow involved on this incredibly big money scheme. By next day president and related. By night of that day people from past governments were found involved, and before we knew it, they had to hire new judges for the main judging branch because this case was now involved with every single politic related person on the country and even some beyond. The case took months, and as you would expect it, nothing of really big consequence happened. Politics people is still around. I think the one who ordered the concrete went to jail and got out after a bit because he harmed himself to get to the hospital. I still wonder why is people so shy to start a ducking revolution here, I swear. Not sure if it's the biggest, but in Australia we had a boom in the mining industry, and finally the gov decided to tax the mining companies that were making massive profits. The story goes that the gov put representatives of the biggest mining companies in a room and told them to come up with a tax for themselves. So they did. Of course, if you come up with a tax then you know how to avoid it. It was reported that they paid zero in the new tax in the first year. Could be recalling it wrong, but generally speaking, expecting an industry to tax themselves at a cost of profit is asking for a screw up. This sounds like precisely what a government owned by big business would do. Not surprised. Ever wonder why your government makes decisions that are clearly against everyone's interests, and that no single party openly supported beforehand? Well, this is it. The decision was made by the people who profit from that decisions. Your elected politicians are just there to muddle the waters so that it looks like democracy. Everything Italy. However, one particular duck up by the government after the reunification was developing only the north, leaving the south poor and underdeveloped. This gap still exists today, after 150 plus years. Mayfair was born as an organization alternative to the government in regions neglected by the state, and quickly came to operate in substitution to it, running businesses, enriching Mayfair's own families, and demanding its own taxes. in the form of protection money that businesses or even homeowners are forced to pay to not have their property set on fire, families kidnapped, murdered. It has a surprisingly structured internal organization, standardized procedures and a systematic network of control over the entire South. In some areas, there's no escaping the Mafia's claws, to the extent where 1. the state has had real trouble even touching it, 2. there is a high chance that the powerless Italian state came to terms with the Mafia via a disgusting secret treaty, the Mafia State Treaty, the ramifications of which are clearly visible in law, and yet we have not learned the truth after more than 30 years. The modern Mafia, however, is also highly active in northern richer regions, especially Lombardy, where most of the financial fraud and money laundering activity takes place. Britain once managed to send a warship to Iceland rather than Ireland. Since then the right now has always written Iceland as Iceland Sea in all documents to avoid this mistake. Not from Myanmar, but I feel like this one is crazy enough that it needs to be posted here. Before 1985, the Burmese kyat was denominated into 1, 5, 10, 25, 50 and 100 kyat notes. On November 3rd, 1985 the two largest notes, 50, 100 were demonetized, declared invalid as legal tender without warning, though the public was allowed to exchange limited amounts of the old notes for new ones. The vast majority of the value the physical notes represented basically vanished overnight. Quick side note, this was actually the second time this happened under this administration. 1 week later, multiply 75 kyat notes were introduced as a replacement, followed next year by multiply 15, 35 kyat notes. 2 years later, once everyone had finally gotten used to dealing in multiples of 35 and 70, the government did the same thing again, demonetizing the 25, 35 and 70 kyat notes, except this time without exchange or compensation. This rendered some multiply 75% of the country's currency worthless and eliminated the savings of millions of Burmese. In the US, this would be equivalent to erasing $1.6 trillion from circulation today. A few weeks later, the multiply 45, 90 kyat notes were introduced. The resulting economic disturbances led to serious riots and eventually a coup d'etat in 1988, whereupon more conventional denominations were reinstated, along with several higher denominations up multiply 10,000 kyat, because the aforementioned policy changes along with many other problems with the prior administration had completely decimated the Burmese economy, resulting in hyperinflation. But here's the truly crazy part, and why I think this is one of the greatest governmental duck-ups of all time. The reason behind the denomination changes. The dictator general at the time was a big fan of numerology. The 75 kyat note was introduced to commemorate his 75th birthday. The 45 and 90 kyat notes were introduced because an astrologer told him that the number 9 was auspicious. Isn't that the same guy who decided the country was becoming too left-wing? And so his solution was to switch without warning to driving on the right side of the road. So even now, catching a bus involves walking around it and into traffic to get to the door, because most of the vehicles in the country are still left-hand drive. Shooting down our own airline, mistaking it for an American missile, and as a result killing everyone on board. They lied about it to the public for 3 straight days. Probably when our corrupt politicians privatized all our banks, sold them to their friends who, through blatant misconduct, caused the economic collapse in 2008. Some of those politicians responsible are still in politics. Just wonderful. From Iceland, by the way. Skullplatformen. Recently the Swedish government spent well over 700 million krona, 70 million on a digital system for high schools, and it's pure shit. Not just inconvenient, it barely works. It's probable closer to 100 mil krona now, since they've kept working on it the past 3 years instead of using Google Classroom, like every other reasonable school would. You think that's bad? Ireland created a new hospital and didn't set a limit on how much it could cost. It's now over $1 billion, is built in a cramped area with only a few stories. Slovakia. I can't decide between 12 years of Robert Fico and Smeresty political party, or whole age of Vladimir Mia. It's hard to decide. On one hand, there is guerrilla recording, baptized Hitler Mafia, kidnapping of Vietnamese businessman and many more. On the other hand, there is true mafia governing the state where there were killing, shootouts or bombs under a car on daily basis, or secret service that kidnapped son of the president. I would still go with Age of Maya. As bad Fico and his Smaresti was. I've never seen a piece of human flesh hanging on the wall after explosion after wild 90 ties. Making Hitler chancellor because you can control him. Go back even further. Why the duck did Hitler get a national platform with his trial and a year in a cushy jail cell to write a biography? Luxembourg and Liebknecht tried to overthrow the government too, and got tortured and shot. And they still wanted a democracy. Hitler openly talked about how the government were traitors and clearly wanted to overthrow democracy, but no one in Weimar gave a shit. Edit. I know why this happened. My favorite class was Germany 77-45. Malaysia. So many, but I'll just do the most recent COVID-19 female CK up. Last year Malaysia was a leading example of managing the pandemic, but the backdoor because quite a few MPs jumped ship from the democratically elected govt and formed another govt decided to hold by-elections in the state of Sabah, and no standard SOPs were followed, leading to a spike in cases. We were well on our way to single digit cases, and today we have an average of 7k cases daily. Well, I'm from Kazakhstan. What can I say about my country's governmental duck-ups? They renamed the name of the capital city into our president's name, Nur Sultan, and also named every major street in every city after the president as well. They have statues of this guy all over the country. Other than that, everything as it goes in a post-Soviet country, corruption from top to the bottom. Money decides everything. Government couldn't care less about the people, you know. Old good bullshit all around. Financial crash in Iceland in 2008. The banks put our country's debt at over 7 times our GDP. It ruined so many lives, and the aftermath is still felt by people who are still in debt or have lost their pensions. Banks also asked customers a week before the crash if they were interested in putting their pensions into some index fund or something, don't really know the right word for it, and make it grow more. They knew what was happening and only used the money to save their asses. Our Prime Minister declared in a TV speech, "God bless Iceland." Then the morning after, people saw their loans, pensions and everything just either skyrocket or disappear. If you ask people how it was, you'd seriously think they'd been inadvertent. People's lives were absolutely ruined, some beyond repair. So in Norway we are weird look on climate change, as we are a driving force for the Paris Agreement, and is therefore looked upon as a great inspiration, mitigating climate change on a great level. But we still have some duck-ups in our own nature. We've allowed dumping of mining waste in our fjords. Still look for oil and gas in the vulnerable north, and we don't look for another way of earning funds for our pension program. The biggest difference made in Norway to help mitigate climate change is just as big a difference as any other first world country. Honestly, we just believe we are better without any proof due to this. Brazilian here. There are many. I'll tell you 2 of the most bizarre ones. Back at 2015, while the country was entering one of the biggest economic crises on Brazilian history, our former president Dilma Rousseff gave 8 billion reais, about $1.5 billion, to some Brazilian contractors to build things on many countries except Brazil. The most recent one, our actual president Jair Bolsonaro refused 100 million doses of Pfizer's COVID vaccine last year, told people to not use masks, and said that people who stay at home to this day are idiots. Australia. Our government ducked up royally when it came to getting better internet. Billions of taxpayers' money down the ducking drain. Murdoch is also a cunt for playing a part in this. I'd say in the big picture selling off the electrical grid was worse, especially the way it was done, so that power generation is owned by billionaires, the transmission owned by the Chinese, and you buy the power from some billing company that provides no value added. Also selling off our telecom network and thinking it was a great idea to have one corporate entity own the infrastructure, the wholesale reseller rights to that infrastructure, as well as the retail sales channel to charge customers to use that infrastructure, and government monopolies being turned into private monopolies. Isn't even the worst part about it. Had the government continued to own the infrastructure and wholesale rights to that infra, they would have been able to raise far more revenue selling access to the network than what they made selling it off. Conservatives love to crap on about how good they are at capitalism, but history across multiple countries shows they really have no ducking idea what they are doing. Hawke royally ducked up by following Thatcher in privatizing. Then Howard and every other leader since has kept up the tradition. I cannot express how much it pisses me off that the governments we've had think it's a good idea to stop having services for the people, owned by the people, making money to be used for the people. Competition is good, but why the heck does that mean you have to not be in the game at all? Telstra, Qantas, Combank, the ducking power grid. Why? Why do you want our crucial infrastructure to not be ours? This year and last year there was a welfare scandal in my country, the Netherlands. People who were on welfare were being accused of fraud and had their welfare taken away. The debts these people were getting in response of this was devastating. I don't know the full details, but it got so bad that our government stepped down. The Great Famine of 1959-1962. While the government claims it was caused by natural disasters, realistically it was caused by economic mismanagement and was most likely man-made. Something like 50 million people starved to death. Both my parents were born during the Great Famine, and both were severely malnourished in utero and during early childhood years. Dad was born premature, and family thought he wasn't going to make it due to lack of food, but somehow he pulled through. They didn't even name him or register his birth until he was 4 months old. Mom was severely malnourished as well. To this day she is significantly shorter and has less hair than her older siblings, even though they were from a military officer family that got more food rations than most families at the time. The baby bonus. In order to combat our declining birth rate, the Australian government decided to give new parent $5,000 when they had a baby. This led to a huge wave of young teenagers having babies and dropping out of school to get a $5,000 payday. Of course most of them were totally unprepared to be parents and the novelty wore off real quick. The foster care and child services systems became overwhelmed. Thousands of kids are growing up in bad situations, unwanted and unloved, because the government didn't think it through properly. New Zealand. The breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi, using Maori slavery as a means to an end in military action despite being outlawed. Last Maori slaves died in the 1950s. The dawn raids in the 1970s-80s when police would do late night early morning raids to crack down on illegal overstayers. 200 years of trying to wipe out the Maori spoken language TedTyro. Despite becoming an official language of New Zealand in 1987, a speaker at a Ratapayers Alliance meeting in Tauranga was abused by the crowd for speaking 6 words in TedTyro this week. Colonization of Western Samoa after World War I. So authoritarian and racist. They wanted the Germans to come back. The racist 10 equivalent to 1,750 New Zealand dollars in 2020 poll tax to restrict Chinese immigration. Only 1 Chinese was allocated per 10 ton of cargo. In 1896 the ratio was changed to 1 Chinese per 200 ton of cargo, and the poll tax was raised to 120,000. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing for more videos.